Hi, Hadley. And this is interesting, isn't it? Because it's certainly a subcurrent that we're seeing flow through the region right now. The protests in Iraq are really significant too, because what we've seen is hundreds of people already being killed, thousands of others are being injured. And really this situation kind of at boiling point right now with the Prime Minister being called upon to resign. When you look at the situation on the streets as well, it's total chaos. This originally started as just a fun street party and then evolved into unrest. In Baghdad, in the green zone, we've actually seen officials and security forces using live rounds to try and push protesters back from that area where we know there are a lot of government offices and foreign embassies, for example. And then further down the road, across the bridge, which has now been blocked by protesters heading into Tahrir Square, you also have security officials essentially using a lot of sound bombs. They're using tear gas. They're using other means to try and push these protesters back. It's also interesting to look at the situation here because these protesters are operating on very similar issues and pushing very similar issues to what we saw in Lebanon, right? It's all about unemployment. It's about corruption. It's about government accountability. And as I mentioned just before, now they're calling on the Prime Minister to resign. I think it's too soon to say perhaps that this is a second spring happening across the region, but it's certainly something to look out for, particularly when you also look at the situation in Egypt, the situation in Lebanon that you've been covering very closely. Perhaps doing one of the final interviews with Lebanon's Prime Minister during his reign, and also now in Iraq too. Certainly an interesting issue for the region.
Absolutely. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch because what do we know about this region, sadly, that revolutions don't tend to end very well. And all revolutions generally, as a historian, we tend to think of them as economic in nature and economic in at least their beginnings. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when the banks open tomorrow in Lebanon. Are we going to see a run on those banks? Are we going to see any kind of confidence restored? You have an entire banking sector really in that country that's been propping up Lebanese debt. I mean, they're the largest holders of Lebanese government debt, right? And they don't tend to lend to the average Joe. And that's part of the anger that we've seen on the streets, particularly facing not just banks themselves, but also Riyad Salameh, the central bank governor. The fact that this was a construct, a financial construct that basically allowed the banks to operate without lending most of their capital to people on the street. And this was something that, you know, everyone that we had spoken to over the last couple of years said this will end up being a very, very bad deal for the Lebanese. And as you see on those protests, they've been largely peaceful again and again, and very much, as you say, like a street party. But at the end of the day, we are now seeing some political pushback because the politicians, the entrenched, corrupt Lebanese political construct based on a confessional system that everyone knows, particularly the Lebanese, doesn't work anyway, are really starting to push back because they're starting to get very scared that the way that they've been able to manage this over the last 30 years since the Civil War may be on its way out.
Absolutely. And when you look at the situation in Iraq as well, the Prime Minister there under increasing pressure, he's essentially held in power by two Shiite clerics. It'll be interesting to see if he decides to perhaps resign, stand aside in the coming days. In Lebanon, you would have to say that the people there are certainly concerned about their own financial situation. That's the reason they went to the street in the first place. If we do see a run on the banks, it's going to bring about significant pressure on whoever fills Hariri's role and at the same time on the central bank governor as well.
I mean, this is at the end of the day. I mean, this is a man whose father was assassinated by that very party that seemingly is supporting him or has at least allowed him to be prime minister, because in this confessional system, this is basically a country that has historically been economically inefficient. Even since Ottoman times, you had this consular system where foreign powers, which they invited to come in, controlling essentially the economics of this country. And that has led to decades and decades of political mismanagement, of economic mismanagement, and frankly, how we see the country shaping up today.
The message from the central bank is very important tomorrow. Absolutely.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.